Maduro's days as Venezuela's dictator are numbered. Now, that's not our claim. That's what Donald Trump himself said in his recent interview on 60 Minutes. He immediately followed this up by saying that he doesn't believe there will be an invasion of Venezuela. Still, for the first time, Trump has publicly, loudly, and clearly predicted the fall of Nicolas Maduro, something that can easily be interpreted as a statement of intent. One for which they continue to mobilize a number of air and naval forces that would shake not only Venezuela, but practically any country in the world. For example, you are surely aware that on October 26th, Washington sent the world's largest and most powerful aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, to the Caribbean. We're talking about a veritable monster weighing some 100,000 tons, nuclear powered and armed to the teeth. It carries an air fleet of about 90 aircraft, among which we find the feared F-18 and F-35. To give you an idea of what we're really talking about, the air capacity of the Gerald Ford from this single ship is actually greater than that of most NATO countries. But it isn't sailing alone. Its carrier strike group includes 3 destroyers and 2 support ships. All of them will join the more than 8 warships, the nuclear submarine, and the F-35 and CV-22 Osprey squadrons that are already threatening Maduro from Puerto Rico. In other words, right now, the Caribbean is more militarized than at any other time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Maduro could have 1 foot out of Miraflores. At least that's what Trump himself suggested on national television, and the logical conclusion of such a massive show of force is clear.
Maduro needs to understand that he has been offered a negotiation process and that if he accepts it, he will be much better off. But he will leave, whatever he decides.
Maria Corina is clear about this, and she could be right. In early October, the Pentagon's Southern Command, which oversees operations in Latin America, already had more than 10% of the entire US fleet deployed there. And with the arrival of the Gerald Ford, that percentage will increase to 14%. It's outrageous. And most importantly, it stands to reason such a deployment must have a purpose. An ambitious one, because otherwise it would make no sense. Well, along these lines, a few days ago, the Miami Herald, one of Florida's most important media outlets, reported that Washington had already decided to attack military installations inside Venezuela. The news spread around the world, but was quickly denied by Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Your sources claiming to have knowledge of the situation tricked you into writing a fake story.
As we've already told you, it will be the president himself who announces any attack against Venezuela. And as we've also said, according to our sources, the final decision has not yet been made. That has not changed. But clearly in recent days, particularly after the announcement of the deployment of the Gerald Ford, rumors have been flying. Are we perhaps only days or weeks away from a conflict breaking out against Nicolas Maduro and his henchmen? Look, I know we've been waiting for news since August, and so far, there has been nothing but an intensification of the campaign of attacks against drug smugglers. The latest attack, on 28th of October, left 14 dead. And since nothing else is happening at the moment, Venezuelans are torn between contained anticipation and growing frustration. But as we've been telling you for quite some time, this time there is reason for hope. Trump may be interested in this story this time around. It could be part of his legacy and help him win votes at a time when the polls are looking grim. Clearly, the latest results from Tuesday the 4th of November, where the Democrats scored a series of important goals, may have been a real accelerator. And if we add to that the massive military deployment, well, of course, everything seems ready. The Gerald Ford and its combat group are too valuable to be sent on a months-long trip to the Caribbean. If it's going to be there, it has to be for a reason. And along these lines, there are analysts in the United States who point to 2 clear signs that an operation is underway. First, the deployment of the Ford itself. And second, the appearance of tents at the former Roosevelt Roads naval base in Puerto Rico.
Satellite imagery taken on October 29th shows 20 new tents southeast of the runway near an abandoned aircraft hangar.
This is a former naval base in the municipality of Saber that was closed in 2004 and left virtually abandoned. However, in recent weeks, it has suddenly become home to F-35 fighter jets and military tents, to the point that many believe it is being unofficially reactivated. In fact, according to analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington could be refurbishing this base with repairs and equipment transfers, which would explain the 20 new military tents that have suddenly appeared. So the question is, why? Is all this also related to Venezuela? Is it being prepared to serve as a base of operations against drug traffickers, or for something bigger related to that hypothetical campaign of attacks on Venezuela? Obviously, when we talk about military preparations, information is always very limited, but that's more or less how things stand. B-1 and B-52 bombers continue to fly off the Venezuelan coast, as do Special Forces helicopters. And while some say these are routine exercises, others claim they are mapping Maduro's air defenses. There are also rumors of increasingly strong GPS interference off the Venezuelan coast, and a few days ago, an additional destroyer docked in Trinidad and Tobago, just a few miles from Venezuela, under the pretext of preparing for joint training. Whatever the case, with all this going on, the question is, what is Maduro's reaction? Well, he continues to respond in his usual style, with his microphone. He tries to appear strong on camera, although in reality, all he shows is fear. For now, he has suspended its energy ties with Trinidad and Tobago as a gesture of retaliation, and the latest development has been the signing of a new pact with Vladimir Putin.
The historic and strategic alliance that President Putin has signed and that I have signed here in Venezuela is for peace. It is for development. It is for transferring its scientific and technological knowledge. In practice, Russia and Venezuela are more united than ever.
Maduro is referring to an agreement signed between Caracas and Moscow to expand cooperation in energy, mining, transportation, communications, and, naturally, security. It's an attempt at a diplomatic lifeline, just when the water is already up to his neck. In fact, in recent days, several Russian cargo planes have been spotted flying to Venezuela.
Heavy Russian cargo plane lands in Caracas amid U.S.-Venezuela tensions.
The latter took off from Russia, with stops in Armenia, Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Mauritania, before heading to Caracas. The reason? To avoid Western airspace and possible cargo inspections in hostile countries. Of course, these stopovers before heading to Caracas have given rise to all kinds of speculation, but whatever those planes are carrying doesn't seem to be enough to calm the nerves among the regime's ranks. Because according to internal reports from Washington, Chavismo's top officials are paranoid. They change phones every week, rotate bodyguards, move house, and avoid using the same cars on consecutive days. No one trusts anyone, because this time, the situation seems different from anything they've ever experienced before. The arrival of the Gerald Ford in the Caribbean, which is imminent, could turn everything upside down. And you may ask, how? Well, we're going to tell you all about that in detail, so let's get started.
The monster of the Caribbean.
The last time the Caribbean saw so many warships together, the world was under threat of disappearing under a nuclear cloud. Today, 6 decades later, these seas are once again heavily armed. Just imagine what it means to have a 25-story building floating on water, powered by nuclear reactors, and capable of launching supersonic fighter jets every 45 seconds. Well, that's exactly what the Gerald Ford is like.
The USS Gerald R. Ford is a $13 billion aircraft carrier sailing to the Caribbean with nuclear propulsion, an electromagnetic plane launcher, and 90 aircraft on board.
The flagship of the US Navy is not just another aircraft carrier, it's the crown jewel, a floating city, a symbol of US power, and apparently the final warning to Maduro. This is the first of a new generation of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers designed to succeed the legendary Nimitz class, which has dominated the seas since the 1970s. We're talking about a ship the size of 3 football fields, which could sail for at least 20 years without refueling. From the sea, it looks like a real mobile airbase. From below, a 20-story steel wall, and from Miraflores, a nightmare. The icing on the cake of a deployment that is by no means coincidental. The fact is, and this is important, every element that Washington has positioned in the Caribbean fits perfectly into the classic US playbook. And it gives us plenty of clues about the 3 phases that the Pentagon could follow in Venezuela if things ever escalated that far. So, how about we start by taking a look at what each of these 3 phases might look like? Because remember, this is the kind of capability the Pentagon is currently deploying. Let's get into it. The Gerald Ford is not coming alone, which is important to bear in mind. It's being escorted by 3 destroyers, which, along with those already in the Caribbean, will add up to a capacity of up to 700 vertical launch cells. So, is this a lot or a little? Well, let me be clear here. It's absolutely outrageous. It's more than enough missile launch capacity to carry out saturation attacks that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to stop. In fact, this is how the first phase of Operation Maduro would most likely begin. in. The accumulated force would allow hundreds of missiles to be launched, including up to 180 Tomahawks against Maduro's regime facilities, drug cartels, or whatever else they want. Of course, it must be clear that Washington's primary objective is always to minimize risks, and to that end, if they were to finally intervene, what they would surely do is launch a first wave of attacks to destroy the strategic targets that could threaten the next phases of the mission. Even so, before pressing the button, you need to have eyes on the ground. In other words, drones, satellites, and spy planes are needed to locate transmitters, validate targets, and confirm damage. This is precisely what we've begun to see happening in recent days. Without this kind of constant vigilance, a Tomahawk could miss its target and turn a surgical operation into a major problem. But anyway, the point is that in this way, from the sea and at a safe distance, precision missiles would be launched to hit very specific targets such as radars, command centers, and, of course, air defense systems and air bases. Keep in mind that Venezuela allegedly has what is considered the best air defenses in Latin America, thanks to its S-300s and the less advanced Buck and Pecora systems, all of which were purchased directly from Moscow during the Hugo Chavez era.
Venezuela's air defenses are the most advanced in Latin America. They would be the first target if the US attacks.
And if you're wondering, okay Josh, but has this been done before? Well, the answer is yes, and not just a few times. To give you an example that likely rings a bell, take the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That began in the early hours of March, when the United States began launching more than 800 Tomahawk missiles. In practically 48 hours, it left the entire country deaf and blind. An operation of this type is the military equivalent of unplugging the router of an entire country, thus clearing the way for the second phase. Well, in Venezuela, the decapitation or punishment operation could begin precisely like this. But as I said, that would only be the beginning. That's when the Gerald Ford mega aircraft carrier could come into play. Stay tuned. Well, once the risks have been neutralized, in other words, Venezuela's defensive capabilities, that's when the creme de la creme would probably enter the scene. Because if, at this point, the Maduro regime had not yet raised the white flag, it would face two different air interventions. The first would be the US's capabilities on land, such as the B-1 and B-52 bombers in the United States, and the F-35s already deployed in Puerto Rico. And the second, deployment from the sea, that is, using the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford and all its air power. And it's here, at this point in the plan, that the Gerald Ford would prove decisive. With up to 90 aircraft on board, it's like having an entire air force stationed at sea a few miles off your coast. These aircraft could also take off in record time, thanks to the Gerald Ford's electromagnetic launch system. To give you an idea, this system is designed to carry out 160 launches per day, and in intensive combat mode, this could reach up to 220. This would allow US fighter jets to take off, strike targets in Venezuela, return to the aircraft carrier to refuel and reload missiles, and then take off again, all in the same day if they wanted. In other words, this aircraft carrier and its escorts would be more than enough to wage war and subdue a country like Venezuela. Well, let's be honest, Venezuela, and basically most countries in the world. We're looking at more than 100 aircraft ready to operate in Caribbean territory, an operation that reminds us, once again, of the Iraqi precedent. Mind you, we're talking about capacity, not that the attacks were like that, but with what is stationed in the Caribbean, it would be enough for dozens and dozens of planes to bomb military infrastructure and strategic positions day and night with pinpoint coordination and without risk. A veritable highway for fighter jets, such as the one created by Israel last June to attack Iran. The Israelis basically did the same thing. First, they took out Iran's air defenses and radars, and then they attacked whatever they wanted, flying over the Persian country as if they owned the place. And that's exactly what could happen here. Let me stress that the capability is either already deployed or is being deployed. But if the real goal were to bring down Maduro and promote regime change, a third intervention might be necessary. I'm talking about carrying out rapid infiltrations by special forces to arrest or even eliminate key figures and then running away. Or rather, flying away. And that could be precisely what the third phase of this operation consists of. Take a look. You see, once we've left the enemy without eyes in the sky and without defensive capabilities, if they still refuse to raise the white flag, the most delicate part of all could come, going in for the prize. And no, we're not talking about occupying the country with 100,000 soldiers, that's out of the question, but rather sending in a team of special forces, taking what they want and getting the hell out of there. For that, the United States has an engineering gem called the CV-22 Osprey. But what exactly are we talking about? A helicopter? An aeroplane? Well, it's neither one nor the other, but both at the same time. The Osprey takes off vertically like a helicopter, but once in the air, it rotates its propellers and flies like an aeroplane. In other words, it can travel long distances, fly higher and faster than a conventional helicopter, and return before the enemy understands what the hell has happened. But what would you do with that? Well, it's very simple. With these aircraft deployed in Puerto Rico, Washington could infiltrate Special Forces commandos, such as Navy SEALs. These aircraft would take off from an island carrier or on an allied island, land in Venezuela, enter a military complex or residence, and carry out whatever Donald Trump has in mind. From executing key figures to simply taking them into custody to bring about the fall of Maduro's regime. Furthermore, the Osprey doesn't fly alone, it's accompanied by Black Hawks. These are more maneuverable, smaller, and perfect for infiltrating urban areas. In fact, it was this same helicopter that was used in the operation to kill Osama bin Laden at his residence in Pakistan. In other words, the Osprey would make longer trips and be deployed in rural areas, while the Black Hawk would facilitate urban raids. All of this supported, of course, by the same toys I mentioned earlier. We've already underlined that the force deployed is outrageous, and furthermore, it's a force specifically designed to carry out this type of operation we're talking about. Washington already has everything it needs in the Caribbean to do all of this. If they wanted to, they could practically destroy all of Chavismo's military capabilities within a few hours. If they wanted to, they could attack strategic targets to decapitate the regime. And if they wanted to, they could even carry out intervention operations to force the issue. The question is, will they do it? Well, in our opinion, it's still hard to see that happening. Most likely, this is a message of maximum pressure. This is what we can do to you whenever we want, if you don't get the hell out of power right now. But of course, at the same time, we're talking about such a large concentration of force that it seems very difficult to think that the issue will be limited to a few bombings of drug boats and a few threats. And I know what many of you are wondering. With such a deployment on his doorstep, why on earth is Maduro still refusing to leave? Why doesn't he just go once and for all? Well, pay attention, because this isn't a Tom Cruise movie. Things are a little different.
The only option, resist.
There's something everyone wonders every time there's new news about Venezuela. How is it possible that after sanctions, blockades, missiles in the Caribbean, protests, blackouts, and even failed coups, Maduro is still there? Happily in power? Does he have a deal with the devil? Or is it simply that the rest of the world is going about things completely wrong? Well, the reality is that Maduro is resisting for three main reasons, and the first one is answered by history itself.
69% of personalist dictators were jailed, forced into exile, or killed after leaving power. So if history is any indication, Maduro's chances of a tranquil retirement are worse than a coin flip.
Imagine you are Nicolas Maduro. You are unpopular. Your economy is in tatters, and half the planet is calling for your head. Apparently, the logical thing to do would be to get on a plane and disappear. Right? Well, no, not exactly. Because in this world, leaving can be more dangerous than staying. If he leaves, he loses everything. Power, money, networks, protection, and perhaps most importantly, his life. And it's not just paranoia. In recent history, almost all neighboring dictators have ended up pretty badly. So Maduro could be making the simplest calculation in the world. If I leave, I'm dead. If I stay, at least I have some options. And the thing is, as surprising as it may seem, those options still exist. For starters, because of the army itself. Chavismo has turned its armed forces into a business network. Each general controls his piece of the pie. Gold, gasoline, contraband, food. As we've said many times, this is no longer an army, it's a veritable mafia, and no one is voluntarily going to shut down their own business. That's why, when the opposition for Washington promises amnesties, many officers laugh, because they've seen this trick before and they don't trust Washington. So they do the math. Do I betray Maduro and lose my mine, my business, and my money, or do I support him and continue stealing with impunity? Well, You already know the answer, and Maduro knows it too, and he plays with it. As long as that balance holds, the option to resist will continue to be better than running away from Miraflores, especially when they know that the United States is not going to deploy troops, and when it's still unclear whether Trump will make the final decision to go after them. And then there's the other factor, the final card of external protection. When you're a sanctioned regime, you need friends who will slip you money under the table, sell you things, buy your oil, and if necessary, defend you at the UN. And yes, Maduro has those friends. Russia, China, and Iran are not with Caracas out of socialist solidarity, but out of strategy. For them, Venezuela is a small spot on the map from which they can inconvenience Washington without too much cost. So, Russia sends military advisors and buys gold. China, albeit more cautiously, continues to do business through front companies, and Iran sends fuel, technology, and even military aid whenever necessary. It's true that they are increasingly distancing themselves from Maduro's regime, and do not blindly trust him. But even minimal symbolic support gives the regime some political breathing room in the eyes of its own people. Let's see. This is surely something that is falling apart as they see more and more forces, more ships, and more planes gathering off their coasts. But it's still a reality. The fact is that if, behind closed doors, you can sell the idea that Moscow still supports and protects you, you can still sell a certain strength. But there's still one more reason, the most perverse of all: fear of change.
Venezuela has become a haven for the activities of all international criminal networks, from drug cartels and Colombian guerrillas to groups that traffic gold and destroy indigenous communities and the environment, arms trafficking networks, and even human trafficking and child prostitution.
Let's see. Let's say Maduro leaves. He runs off to Moscow or Havana, surrenders, is overthrown or whatever. But then what? Well, that's anyone's guess. Because we're talking about a broken country with weapons circulating among various groups, armed Chavista collectives, drug traffickers with their own armies, and Colombian National Liberation Army guerrillas promising to defend the Bolivarian revolution at all costs. It's a jungle out there. Never has that been more true. In Caracas, they think this uncertainty about the future could end up dissuading Washington from really committing to overthrowing the regime. The only option here would be for Venezuelans themselves to step up and take advantage of the scenario created by the United States. If there is real opposition to Maduro, that would encourage the White House to move forward. In other words, on this occasion, the active participation of Venezuelans could be crucial. VisualPolitik community, at this point, the question that once again hangs over the Caribbean is, can Venezuela finish the job if the United States only applies pressure from the outside? We don't know if Trump is really plotting something or just improvising for show, but we do know that Marco Rubio is increasingly involved in this mess in Venezuela. And if there's one thing Rubio wants above all else, it's to see the fall of Chavismo and later of Castroism in Cuba. It would be his great political legacy as Secretary of State and a political springboard for 2028, or a golden retirement in Florida. This remains the big question. But as we always say, only time will tell. Until then, the questions are for all of you. Do you think the arrival of the Gerald Ford marks a turning point in this whole story? Do you think there could be an Operation Maduro like the one we've told you about to definitively overthrow Chavismo? Well, leave your opinions below in the comments and let's start the debate. And very importantly, if you like this video, give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. As always, thank you so very much for being there. All the best. I will talk to you next time.